Our first panel, new perspectives on compassion across disciplines, and I'd like to introduce Yotam, Heineberg, and the rest of the panelists to come up. It's really a joy to introduce Yotam, who's a clinical psychologist, but he was also a fellow and is presently a healthcare fellow at CCARE and has been doing really groundbreaking work with Paul Gilbert and others on compassion-focused therapy, as well as development of a compassion skills training program with another one of our collaborative scientists, Dan Martin. Where's Dan? Oh, Dan's a good-looking guy sitting up here. So, Yotam, without further ado.
Good afternoon. It's a joy and an honor to be here with you today, and it's a delight to launch our first panel for today. Like Jim mentioned, like Dr. Doty mentioned, I'm a person helping with healthcare as well as other compassion interventions at CCARE. And really what we do is strive to develop interventions that impact people by way of increasing resilience and compassion for various populations, as well as acknowledging that while we do a lot of work in person with wonderful impact, the pace with which everything is growing towards a technological movement is not to be ignored by us in the compassion field. So we're also very active in trying to think about various compassion and resilience building intervention that we can deliver online as well. It's really wonderful to tell you about the members of our panel here that are representing various disciplines. So I'll tell you a little bit about each person, and then we will invite them to offer our talk. So first we have, representing the humanities perspective, John Gillies, who's an honorary senior lecturer in general practice at the University of Edinburgh. We also have with us Professor Paul Gilbert. He's a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Derby. He's also the president and founder of the Compassionate Mind Foundation. And I'm also very grateful to have Paul as a mentor. I've learned a lot about compassion and compassion-focused therapy from him. And then we have two more speakers from business and organizations. We have Monica Worline, who's a research scientist at CCARE at Stanford, as well as an affiliate faculty at the Ross Business School, University of Michigan. And with her presenting is Birgitta Pessi, who's a professor of church and social studies at the University of Helsinki. And our first presenter for today is going to be John Gillies. So we're excited to have you. Please.
Thank you very much, Yotam, for that kind introduction. And thank you to many people here, but especially to Monica and Jim for organizing our event, our joint event today. This is what I'm going to talk about. I'm a family physician, as Jim said, but I'm going to talk about humanities. I hope that's not too dissociative for you here, but I think compassion is a discipline that crosses boundaries, and I think I'm going to try to do that today. So, I'm co-director of the GHA Compassion Initiative. I'm going to talk about this little book, Tools of the Trade, which Poems for New Doctors, which has been produced for the last 2 years by the Royal College of GPs and the Medical and Dental Defence Union of Scotland, with an editorial board drawn from the University of Edinburgh, Reverend Ali Newell, myself, and the wonderful Scottish Poetry Library. This is where I'm from, in the Western Isles of Scotland. I put this up because it's a really lovely slide, and because beyond these low hills, so on the west coast of Scotland, lies America, and many of my relatives were economic migrants to America and Canada in the 19th and 20th century. Compassion and the humanities is a big theme, and my new perspective is that of poetry. Poetry is as old as the hills, old as humanity, really. But I'm going to talk about this book of poetry for new doctors. We gave this to all new doctors in Scotland in 2014 and 2015. We're just producing the second edition, which will be out in April. And there is a flyer there if anyone wishes to pre-order it. It will cost about $8. I'll tell you about why we produced the book and what its significance is. But first of all, I just want to show you why it's important by reading a poem from the book. It's a poem by a doctor called Kenneth Dale Bierink. And it was crowdsourced from an article I wrote about the book from for the British Medical Journal, and we asked doctors to send in poems that they thought might suit young doctors. We got hundreds of poems who really made a rod for a own back, but this one made the cut. It's called Jackson Spander. He hadn't the wits to show me the signs, like his friend had done, to convince me he was crazy enough to be committed just for the winter. He didn't have the courage to say he was famished, that his bed sore was oozing stinking pus, that he didn't have the strength to ride the boxcar to Pensacola this year, that he thought he was afraid of dying alone on a park bench. He didn't even know he was asking me to take care of him. Hey, Doc, I was taking care of myself long before your daddy had fuzz on his chin. And when he laughed, he hacked his bloody phlegm through a toothless, smelly grin and filled his paper cup. But he spent that winter on my ward in the VA hospital. It was only last week that I found out that Dr. Kenneth Bierning was in fact a Stanford graduate of the 1960s, so I really had to read the poem. It's about compassion, this poem. It's clear that the doctor looks kindly and with empathy on the patient, Jackson Spander. He sees him not just as a homeless, unwashed old man with tuberculosis, but as a suffering, ill human being, possibly near the end of his life, who has the same moral value as the doctor and who has pride. He sees him as a fellow human being. He shows his intention to ease his suffering by admitting him to hospital for the winter, perhaps easier in the 1960s in San Francisco or London or Edinburgh than it would be today. I think it also shows compassionate courage. I wonder what Dr. Bierning's superiors might have said when they found Jackson Spander on their wards the following morning. Bierning published one book of poems called Ward Rounds. All his poems are beautifully crafted, wonderfully structured, and show real compassion. He died quite young from leukemia in 1969. So that's a poem from the second edition of Tools of the Trade. This is what Dr. Leslie Morris and I said in the introduction. Being a doctor is a privilege. You will hear stories that perhaps no one else has heard. Patients will share their innermost feelings and secrets with you. The art of listening is a precious one. You will learn from patients about their lives, their illnesses, and about yourself. It is also emotionally draining and difficult, and that's why we have crafted this book of poems. Art and literature can provide invaluable insights into the human condition. We chose these poems to be intelligible, short, and in some way spoke to the experience of both being a doctor and being a human being. Here are a few quotes from young doctors who read the anthology. They've been peer-reviewed. There's an important emphasis around thinking of patients as human beings, not treating diagnosis just, but also the person and being considerate of the patient's thoughts and feelings. And what I found interesting about this is that if you need a book of poetry to say that, what are we doing in medical education? Why is it that we are producing doctors who need a book of poetry to remind them? Overall, the poetry made me think about caring for patients in a holistic manner with more compassion. And the last quote, which I won't read for time, is about connection. It's about connecting with your peers, connecting with your patients. So compassion is for everyone, including the doctor, and I often think the doctor's family as well. We need to care and be compassionate to others. We need to care and be compassionate for ourselves. Why did we produce this book? We produced this book because of an experience of mine with a colleague. It came from a colleague called Dr. Pat Manson, a hard-working, compassionate, conscientious family physician who worked for 30 years, and then, without warning, he took his own life. And we know that both here and in the UK, doctors have very high rates of completed suicide. And I think this is often due to lack of self-compassion and a perfectionist culture among the medical profession. And so Pat had spoken of editing a book of poems for young doctors, and this is one of his legacies. Another was the many GPs whom he trained who are now working all over the world. Having started with an American poet, I have to finish with a Scottish one, Douglas Dunn, not a doctor. This is 4 lines from a poem he wrote called Disenchantments, which was written, I think, shortly after the death of his wife. Mineral loneliness, the hour of stone, a boat cut loose, not much to steer it with, grey branches hanging over Acheron. Look to the living, love them, and hold on. And let me finish with a picture. I put this picture up actually for Masha Doty. This is another picture of Scotland. It's a picture of the Culin, the big mountain range on the island of Skye. It's an iconic range. The poet Sorley MacLean used it as a symbol for strength, resilience, power, courage, and also compassion. And in his, towards the end of his poem, he has a line which I'll read. It's a Scottish Gaelic poem. So in Scottish Gaelic, he says, "Chulain hayakeli tuv illa dulga." And in English, that means, the Culin rises on the far side of sorrow. And we should never forget that compassion, which arises from a response to sorrow and suffering, is one of the strongest, most resilient forces in the universe. And we hope that this book will help our young doctors achieve that strength and resilience in their personal and professional lives. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for a most inspiring presentation. And now we'll invite Professor Gilbert.
So first, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And my link to Edinburgh is that I actually did a PhD in depression and started in 1975, would you believe? Okay, so we like to give some advice in the Compassionate Foundation. And our advice for today is, if at first you don't succeed, skydiving is not for you. All right. So we've been working with compassion for many years as a psychotherapy, and it's very important that we understand what exactly compassion is. So compassion is linked to motivation. That motivation is linked to the evolution of caring in mammals, mammalian caring systems. And we know that motivational systems organize the mind. So if you're organized for threat, this will organize how you pay attention, how you think, what kinds of behaviors. If you're organized by competitive motives, and we know this is society, Western societies have grossly overvamped competitive motives, and many of the people that come and see us in our clinics are suffering from an overdeveloped competitive motive. It's okay if you're a winner, but not so good if you feel like you're a loser, an inferior, and a failure. And of course, what we're interested in is generating compassionate motivation, because compassionate motivation will organize your mind. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go very quickly through our understanding of compassion, and then I'm going to show you a 5-minute video, which is how compassion can be used for people who have a particular form of mental health problem where they hear voices. Most definitions of compassion will be something like this. This is taken from the Buddhist, the Dalai Lama's definition, the sensitivity to suffering or distress of self and others with a deep commitment to try to relieve and prevent it. This means that the motivation of compassion splits down into 2 psychologies. The first is linked to courage, and that was mentioned earlier. You think of the doctors and the clinical staff rushing to Western Africa for the Ebola crisis, for example. You're not going to do anything if you don't have courage. Courage is at the center. For those of you who are interested in more spiritual traditions, then both Buddhism and Christianity has courage. The courage to act on behalf of others is at the center of the process of compassion. It also requires dedication, because intentionality and courage are not enough. If I see somebody falling into the sea here and I jump in to save them, that's great, but not if I can't swim. It's great if you want to be a doctor, that's fantastic, but then you're going to have to study for many, many years. So we need dedication. So you need the 2 things associated with compassion. These 2 psychologies break down into 12 constituents, which I'll go through very quickly. First is the motivation. Obviously, you have to be motivated. That means you have to pay attention in a certain kind of way. And when you pay attention to suffering, this is going to cause an emotional reaction. That emotional reaction to suffering is called sympathy. Then you have to be able to not turn your computer off. Be distress sensitive, tolerant. If you can't tolerate the distress of suffering, you run away, you dissociate, that's a problem. Empathy is an important quality, but empathy has to be directed by a motivation. There's a brilliant paper that's been published by a guy called Zaki here in this university called Empathy is a Motivated Construct. If you are offered the chance of an empathic or a non-empathic torturer, always go for the non-empathic one, I would advise you. Non-judgment is also very important. So just empathy then needs to be linked to motive, because we can use empathy in many ways, both as self-interest but also to be helpful. In terms of the second psychology, this relates to paying attention to what is helpful, the ability to understand, to use our reasoning and our wisdom, the ability to use a certain kind of feeling. And here again, the importance of what is compassionate behavior. Okay, so rushing into the house to save the child from the burning house, that is courageous, that has a very different feeling than if you're working with somebody who's dying. And that might have a very different feeling to if you're attending somebody who's had a car accident. So feelings vary according to the situation. Okay, I've done it again. There we go. Also, what's important is the different emotion systems. Now, emotions are not the same as motives. Motives are different. Emotions guide motives, and we know that from an evolutionary function analysis we have three types. One is to do with threat, anxiety and anger, very common. Then you have your drive emotions, ones of excitement. If you win the lottery, I think in America you can win up to $1 million, so you'd have a dopamine rush, you'd become hypermanic. Mind you, one of my paranoid patients said, "Oh no, Dr. Gilbert, oh no, I wouldn't want to win the lottery. To think of all the people that want to kill you for your money." We also know there is a soothing system which is linked to the parasympathetic system, sometimes linked to rest and digest. And this has a very major impact on how we orientate our minds, how the frontal cortex works. And in our psychotherapy, that is the system that is often underdeveloped in many of our patients. We also know, as was mentioned earlier by John, the importance of flow. There's compassion you feel for others. There's the ability to be open to the compassion from others, and this is extremely important because we find that many of our patients have not received much in the way of compassion, particularly in their early childhood, and are often very distrustful of it. And there's also self-compassion. We also know that this flow is really important. It's like a breath. Okay, so you can't just focus on one aspect of it. And we also know that organizations can facilitate the flow, but they can also inhibit it. And we know that there are many organizational structures that absolutely inhibit it. The NHS in England, for example, in UK, has been under serious attack because many of the government changes are major inhibitors. And in our view, you cannot just look at the facilitators of compassion. You have to understand inhibitors, because you can do all the facilitation you like, but if you have a lot of inhibitors in the system, which sadly we do, you're going to run into problems. We know that many of the people that come to see us have what we call undifferentiated affects. In other words, their minds are full of different kinds of emotions. And what compassion allows you to do is to have insight into how these emotions work. So compassion does a lot of good things. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to show you the video which will bring all this together for you.
This is a film about Stuart. Stuart and his voices.
You can't do football it today. Brush your teeth. No way. Football. Get up. Useless.
These circles represent our three major emotion systems and how they are balanced. The threat system kicks in.
They're coming for you. They've set you up. They know what you've done. They'll lock you up and never let you out. You might as well give up now. This is too much. It's all too much. Pathetic.
Stuart's drive system comes online.
Come on, Stuart. They don't want you in the team. Miss. Go on, miss.
Stuart is starting a therapy to help him cultivate compassion for himself, his feelings, and his voices.
Weak. You're weak for seeking therapy. You're weak. Be a man. Walk away. Don't trust her.
Over time, Stuart's therapist gradually helps him to feel more safe. They practice exercises that help him feel more grounded and still. Slowing down his body using breathing and imagery, activating his soothing system. Stuart develops an image of an ideal, compassionate person, focusing on each of its compassionate qualities. He tries to imagine what it would be like to step into this image and become this compassionate person. He walks around, acting the part of his compassionate self, getting a sense of what that would feel like, how he would think, what he would do. He practices at home as well, and gradually begins to deepen his understanding and sense of his compassionate self. As Stuart feels safer, stronger, and more courageous, he decides to start a conversation from his compassionate self to his most critical voice.
Hello. What do you want, loser? I want to understand you. I want to help you feel safe. Safe? Nothing's safe round here. If it wasn't for me, you'd be... I know you're trying to help me. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me that I get scared. You're right, I do. But I want to start overcoming my fears now. I'm ready. You want to get rid of me. No, I don't. I don't want to get rid of anyone. We can work on this together.
Hearing voices is a common human experience. It can often be linked to something difficult or painful that's happened in the past. Although tricky at times, with lots of practice and encouragement, Stuart's compassionate self becomes better developed.
Danger! Back to bed. You're not ready. It's okay, guys. Thanks for the warning. I'll keep an eye out, but there's things I need to do today. Hey, it's all right. We can manage this. We'll see. Hey!
Stuart now feels safe in relation to his voices. He understands and accepts them. They're very much part of the family, but no longer running the show. With his compassionate self in the driving seat, Stuart can now follow his true desires.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And I think the really cool thing to highlight with compassion-focused therapy that it's a brilliant therapy that helps lots of people in psychotherapy. And it's also brilliant in the sense that it can go far beyond that and be helpful to all humans, I believe. And we've done different projects, and obviously Professor Gilbert has done many more projects showing that this perspective, this approach is really a way to more deeply understand the human experience and offer a path towards resilience, an increase in compassion for many, many different populations, not just the clinical emphasis. So that's an important thing to highlight there. So thank you for this. And now we're going to invite Dr. Worline and Dr. Pessi to join us for our final presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm Monica Worline. I'm an organizational psychologist working in collaboration with CCARE and building on the great work that Yotam and Paul have presented to examine the organizational and social process factors that help create more compassionate workplaces and more compassionate community organizations. I have brief time with you today, so I have 3 objectives. One is to give you just a small taste of a new project that is in the works in collaboration with CCARE about compassion as an antidote to dehumanizing work cultures, and a project that CCARE is shepherding that will create the first ever Oxford Science handbook that focuses on the science of compassion. And then finally, to share with you another global collaborator, Birgitta Pessi, who I think is doing wonderful work in the compassion and organization space. And in the spirit of global collaboration, I wanted to share my time with her. So, as I was thinking about today's theme, which is compassion and machines, robots, artificial intelligence, I was really intrigued to share with you a way that I have been thinking about the role of technology in contemporary work. It doesn't actually matter what workplace I go into nowadays as an organizational psychologist. I hear the same refrain over and over again, which is that there's no time to think. And when we think in social psychology about what the word dehumanization means, it's obviously a very strong word, but social psychologists understand dehumanization to mean a social process whereby I may discount you by making you a little bit more like an animal or a little bit more like a machine. And in contemporary work organizations, we are dehumanizing ourselves and each other all the time because we do all kinds of things that make ourselves more like machines in the service of doing our work. Now, this isn't an incredibly new insight. You might recognize Weber up here writing about the theory of bureaucracy, in which he explicitly compares agents in the bureaucracy to oxen being harnessed into the yoke. So that's dehumanizing by making people into animals, right? So that's built into the structure of bureaucracy, that form of dehumanizing. He also famously compared people in bureaucracies to cogs in a machine. And that has entered the lexicon. We now often don't want to be cogs in a machine, but we know that organizations can make us much more like machines. I think that one question to consider today as we move into the distinguished panel that focuses on artificial intelligence is to hold in mind the question of when we work in organizations that leave us no time to think, no matter what job role we have, even professors don't have time to think anymore. Where are the limits of how much that our work can turn us into machines without losing the distinctive humanity that actually makes organizations capable of doing incredible things? So right here in Silicon Valley, we have many examples of dehumanized work cultures, and I could draw from lots of them. But I've been focused lately on developing some new propositions about compassion and leadership. And I heard a story that I wanted to share with you along the themes of dehumanizing work and what is the role of a leader to create compassion that can actually counterbalance the dehumanizing forces that are already built in to work organizations. So a very distinguished Silicon Valley company whose name you would recognize if I used it was having a large event. And the press officer for that company didn't show up at the event. It turned out that he didn't show up at the event because his wife was having their first child. She had some very significant complications in her pregnancy, and both the wife and the baby's lives were threatened. And he made a choice to have his deputy handle the press event so that he could be at the hospital with his wife and his baby. The CEO of the organization wrote a note the same night after the press event saying, "The next time you miss an event, you can look for a new job." So I propose to you, and what we have written in a new chapter for the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, that one email fired off by a leader does a great deal more than send one message to one person. That leaders shape the context for compassion in important ways, and this is a map of that shaping, the way that we have theorized it together, my colleague Jane Dutton and I, that their compassion always unfolds in response to pain and suffering, as Professor Gilbert showed us, and that pain has to be expressed in ways that in an organization can be noticed or ignored. And leaders do a great deal to make it easier or harder to express pain in their organizations, and they do a great deal to determine for other people whether we will take notice of that pain or ignore it. As they do that, they help the entire organization make meaning of a painful event. So in the case where it's not okay to miss one night of work, even when your wife and your first child's lives are threatened, making meaning of suffering is going to be don't have any, right? Don't have any if you want to work here. Certainly don't show it. It's not okay, it's not safe, and that blocks the feeling of empathic concern that we can build for each other or block for each other in the institutions we create. When we don't feel empathy for each other's suffering, we don't take action, which means in an organization we can't measure compassion, we can't see anything happening, and so we can't track the outcomes of compassion. When we do see leaders who effectively lead for compassion at work, we've gathered evidence across a number of disciplines that show that this form of leadership, fostering greater expression of pain in the workplace, fostering greater attention to suffering and compassion, making meaning of suffering in a way that helps people feel empathy rather than indifference or disdain, and helping people find creative ways of taking action, has a number of strategically significant outcomes that I've listed here, like bolstering innovation quality, bolstering service quality, creating adaptability to changing regulatory environments or changing product environments, recruiting and retaining talented people, and keeping them engaged in their work. I recently had the pleasure of presenting this work in Finland with Birgitta Pessi's team, and I was so impressed by what they were doing that I really wanted to share the last few minutes of my time with Birgitta as a new CCARE collaborator, building on this global collaboration initiative to talk about compassion and work.
Thank you, Monica. So kind from you to share the little time that you were given. And I'm so very happy to be here. And such a fascinating program we have. And I feel so blessed to learn the story of Stuart. And I feel so blessed and grateful to learn from the beautiful and deeply moving poems. Wonderful. So I direct this rather exciting project called Co-Passion. It's a group of 12 talented researchers, and 3 of them, please do wave hands, Ti, Anna, and Mia. They are wonderful researchers. And our focus in this project is to study compassion at work. What is compassion? Also in the sense of co-passions, and I will return to this later. What is compassion in workplaces? How is it born and strengthened, and how does it affect well-being, trust, and also performance? And we study this question through 3 angles. And the most novel case of these 3 cases concerns compassion interventions. In different organizations, from private sector and also public sector workplaces, we have conducted, for instance, emotion skills trainings, also self-compassion trainings, but I think most exciting part are these emotion skills trainings. And we have explored their power through participant versus control group settings and with various research methods. And the findings seem to be rather promising. Emotional skills indeed can be trained also at workplaces and also in Finland. And also, yeah, well, I could talk a little more about that. But also, we can find statistically significant differences between these groups of people. For instance, in the fear of expressing compassion at workplaces. But compassion is not only about individuals or organizations. And what I'm personally very intrigued about is the role of societal level analysis in the research of compassion. For instance, how do societal structures, cultural constructs of care, value landscape, religious landscape, crisis, societal shared media narratives, how do all that affect compassion? And Monica so wisely referred to Weber earlier, so the sociological concepts and framework is there, and I would love to see that rise a little more. But then this notion of co-passion, what is that about? Meaningful moments in individual life are of course about noticing, co-feeling, and about acting to alleviate someone's suffering. But these meaningful moments of alongsidedness are also about co-feeling and about actions to share someone's joy, someone's excitement and positive passions. Now I jumped a little too far. So not only the negative emotions, but the positive emotions as well. And that is what we call co-passions. And in a meaningful relationship, can we ever separate one from the other? And I believe that the fascinating studies about the positive power of robot dogs in nursing homes illustrates exactly this. We are so deeply relational, and compassion and co-passions mix. Someone is there with you and for you in pain and in joy, even if it were just a robot dog. And my last point is this, that the human sense of meaning comes from connecting with, but also connecting for someone else. We do not only need compassion, but we need to be able to express compassion to someone. And I'm intrigued by the theme of reciprocity. And Liz already so beautifully, so touchingly talked about the theme of reciprocity. And I would be intrigued to learn a little more, perhaps this afternoon, what would be the question of reciprocity about when we talk about robots. Are we able to give compassion in those cases too? But thank you, and thank you, Monica, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for all of our distinguished speakers. And this concludes our first panel. And the second is to come very, very soon, I think.